Mr. Chairman. First, I want to thank Senators Klobuchar and Kennedy for their astute observations and for their efforts in this area, taking on something of a daunting challenge, addressing big tech, and especially addressing some of big tech's more pernicious influences on so many markets and so many industries. Healthy news industry is, of course, really important in a system of government like ours. In order for the people to have access to their ability to self-govern, they have to have access to the facts. And so you need an effective means by which information about government can be communicated so that people can make appropriate decisions with regard to the government, decisions that will affect them. This is important for all news outlets to be able to communicate that information accurately and effectively and efficiently. This is especially true for local news. Today, it's becoming clear that local journalism is struggling and that some of our major tech platforms at least share some of the blame in that. One of the areas where this is abundantly clear is in digital advertising. Google and Facebook have something of a stranglehold on the primary revenue source for online publications. And that's why earlier this year I introduced the Competition and Transparency in Digital Advertising Act to fix that very problem. And I'm pleased to have a bipartisan group of senators with me on that, including Senators Klobuchar, Cruz, Blumenthal, Hawley, Daines, and Rubio as co-sponsors. This bill that we're here to discuss today, the Journalism and Competition and Preservation Act, has the stated purpose, stated laudable purpose of improving competition and helping local journalism. Unfortunately, I believe that if this bill were to become law, it wouldn't do that. To the contrary, the JCPA has great potential to be disastrous for competition in the news industry itself, and great potential also to crush local news under the thumbs of big tech and big media. This new version of the JCPA, it's a new version that though entirely rewritten from its prior version, still shares at least three underlying flaws with the original version. First, this version of the JCPA would inextricably link the financial incentives of big tech and the news industry by requiring tech platforms to share their monopoly rents with news publishers, making publishers more dependent on big tech, not less. Allowing publishers to share in big tech's monopoly rents would give them, I fear, the incentive to cover up and defend big tech rather than hold big tech accountable. Second, the JCPA would skew and distort the news coverage of politicians. This bill is a government handout to the news industry. The press will still be incentivized to attack those who oppose it and give a pass to those who support it. And I'm confident that I'm not the only person in this room who's concerned about further politicizing journalism. Sadly, the damage may have already been done simply by introducing this legislation. Third, the JCPA is fundamentally flawed in that it seeks to improve competition by sanctioning the formation of cartels, because that is what it does. That is its purpose. That's how this thing operates. It is allowing and sanctioning the formation of cartels in this area. So let's be clear about what we're doing, what we're considering. And we've already seen the evidence that Google and Facebook colluded to monopolize the digital advertising markets. We've seen that in great abundance. Do we really think that forcing one cartel to negotiate a backroom deal with another cartel is going to make things better? You know who won't be represented in the room? You know, consumers, readers, voters. Who's going to represent their interests if we don't protect the free market that allows them to have a voice, that allows them to impact the way this industry works as it's supposed to in any industry? Now, I'd like now to discuss some of the new problems that this entirely new, rewritten version of the JCPA introduces that weren't in the original version. For example, the bill attempts but fails to prevent discrimination. When publisher cartels can't exclude members based on their size or their views, there are multiple proxies one can imagine. Discrimination by audience type or geographic market could be used to exclude certain areas of the country. Now, what if a cartel wanted to exclude publishers that serve rural areas or those whose audience is predominantly lower income? There's a recent article that put it this way. These self-appointed mainstream and left-wing media cartels are allowed to exclude based on the usual totally subjective factors they always do, such as trustworthiness, fake news, extremism, misinformation, hate speech, conspiracy, correction policy, expertise, authoritativeness, etc. To my fellow conservatives, do we think that forcing big tech and big media to get into a room together to collude and agree on the terms under which news can appear on tech platforms, do we think that's going to result in anything good for our voices? Do we think that's going to ameliorate or eliminate censorship? The JCPA is meant to help small local publishers. But importantly here, the text of the bill makes clear that it will actually crush them. First, just look at the definition of the term eligible publisher and qualifying publication. While it's limited to publications with no more than 1,500 employees, it still includes conglomerates that own multiple publications. So a single newspaper with 1,501 employees, for example, is out, unless, of course, they can do some more layoffs and take advantage of the government handout as a result. While the national conglomerate that owns scores of 1,000 employee publications would be covered by this, would be allowed to collude and enter into a cartel. So why does this matter? Well, Section 4D5E2 of the bill requires that any final arbitration decision under the bill would have to direct 65% of the money collected from the platform to be distributed to cartel members based specifically on the number of employees they have. In other words, the bigger you are, the greater the share of the monopoly rents that you get. And this is not just a small sliver of it that's determined on the basis of how many employees the publication has. This is 65%, the vast supermajority of the revenue collected under this. So the bigger you are, the more monopoly rents you get. A small local publisher that puts a real effort, real sweat, blood, and tears, shoe leather into quality reporting that gets traction and clicks on a platform generating revenue for the cartel won't actually get the lion's share of the money that it earned. Instead, it'll be handed out to the larger cartel members based on the number of employees they have. And this doesn't help small publishers. Quite to the contrary, it further entrenches the much larger incumbents. And recall that Section 6A of the bill, as currently written, expressly prohibits preventing a publisher from joining the cartel based on the publisher's size. There's nothing the little guys can do to stop the big guys from coming in and eating their lunch. 65% of their lunch, to be precise. So when you boil it all down, the JCPA is just a way to transfer wealth from a politically disfavored group to a politically favored one, under the guise of supposedly improving competition. But it doesn't actually improve competition. Instead, it imposes massive transaction costs in the form of lawyer fees, expert fees, and arbitration costs. Now, setting aside the failures in concept and in execution, the JCPA is arguably unconstitutional. The bill countenances no world in which a publisher can refuse to distribute the content of a publisher. In fact, doing so is forbidden by the anti-retaliation clause. This seems to me to be something likely to amount to a violation of the First Amendment, because it's compelled speech. There are few areas of First Amendment jurisprudence that are clearer than in the area of compelled speech. One of the things that we hold sacred in this country is that the government, in addition to telling you you can't say something, it's also very, very prohibited for the government to tell you you must say something. So how ironic that a bill meant to protect the only industry named in the First Amendment would do so by violating the right to free speech. Now, it also forces the platforms to pay for publishers' content, whether they want it or not. And so in that respect, it amounts to a sort of Obamacare for the press. But regardless of that, the policy problems, the constitutional problems, the conceptual problems in this bill can't be saved by the good intentions which I greatly admire and efforts which I appreciate, to hold big tech accountable. Many of the same arguments that I've raised have been outlined in an outstanding letter submitted to the committee by Professor Daniel Francis of NYU Law School, and I'm going to submit that to the record, Mr. Chairman. But I urge my colleagues to oppose this bill. While it's a laudable aim, that is protecting local journalism from the predation of big tech, its pursuit of that goal is irreparably flawed, and it risks causing immense harm both to journalism and to competition. It'd be better called the Journalism Cartel and Protectionism Act. This legislation, written in the shadows by trade groups and a small handful of special interests, is simply not ready for prime time. The committee should send it back to the drawing board for reconsideration through a more open and transparent process. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.